The Appalachian Trail. Over 2,000 miles of untamed wilderness, stretching from Georgia to Maine, a path that promises peace, freedom, and, sometimes, horror. To most, it's a challenge, a pilgrimage through mist and mountain. But for a few unlucky souls, it became something else entirely. Out here, when the sun fades and the woods go silent, you start to hear things. Footsteps behind you, voices that echo just out of reach. And if you're not careful, the forest will remember your name. Every year, hikers vanish. Campsites are found abandoned. Some stories make the news. Others are swallowed whole by the trail itself. Tonight, we're stepping deep into those shadows to hear 5 true Appalachian Trail survival horror stories that still haunt those who live them. So before we begin, grab your pack, light your lantern, and make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to walk this trail alone. Hit that like button to keep the fire burning and turn on notifications so you never miss what's waiting in the dark. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin the descent. I remember the sound of the morning that day. Not birdsong or wind, but the soft scrape of nylon as I unzipped the tent and stepped into the chill. Maine air feels cleaner somehow, like it hasn't been breathed before. The Appalachian Trail stretched ahead, a long green ribbon vanishing into fog. I'd walked almost 2,000 miles, only a few hundred to go. The woods were damp from the night's rain. My boots sank slightly in the moss. Every step gave that quiet chef sound I'd come to love, proof I was still moving, still alive, still chasing the end of a dream that had started decades before. I was 66, not 26, but that didn't matter. The trail didn't care about age. It only cared about respect. That morning, my hiking partner had gone ahead. I told her I'd catch up. I stopped for a sip of water, adjusted my pack, and stepped a few feet off the trail, just a few to find some privacy behind a stand of fir trees. When I came back, the white blazes were gone. I turned once, twice. Every trunk looked the same. My footprints had already vanished into the sponge of moss and pine needles. No problem, I whispered to myself. Trail's just over there. I pointed in what I thought was the direction I'd come from and started walking. 5 minutes later, the slope curved downward. The trees thickened. I should have hit the path again, but the forest only grew denser. I stopped, listening for other hikers, for any hint of the familiar rustle of trekking poles or human voices. Nothing. I took a deep breath and laughed, a short, nervous sound that disappeared instantly into the trees. You're fine, Jerry. You've hiked this long. You've got your compass, your map. You're fine. I pulled the compass from my pack. The needle spun, jittered, and then pointed south, except the map said I needed to head east. I didn't trust the needle. Maybe it was the metal in my phone or the ridge above me throwing it off. I picked a direction that felt right and walked. Minutes became an hour. The terrain dropped into a ravine, slick with moss and water. My foot slipped. I caught myself on a root, heart hammering. When I finally climbed out, I checked the GPS on my phone. No signal, just the taunting gray bar of nothingness. The fog rolled in thicker. The light changed, softer but darker at the same time, as if the sun was already giving up. I called out then. Once, twice. Hello? Anyone there? Only the echo of my own voice came back, warped and distant. That was the first time I felt it, the quiet panic that starts deep in your stomach, the kind that whispers, what if? I told myself to stop. Panic wastes time. I found a small flat spot and dropped my pack. Ate a granola bar, forced myself to chew slowly. I'd wait for someone to come by. The trail wasn't far. Someone would pass, but no one came. By evening, I realized I'd wandered far from the ridgeline. The light dimmed to a bruised gray. I needed a place to sleep. I pitched my tent beside a cluster of birch trees, trying to pretend it was just another night. Inside, I unrolled my sleeping bag and took out my journal. My hand trembled slightly as I wrote, "Lost the trail today. Camped near a stream. We'll find it in the morning." I tried not to think about my husband, George, waiting for the evening message I'd promised to send. The one that wouldn't come. That first night was colder than any I remembered. Every snap in the woods made me flinch. At one point I thought I heard footsteps slow, deliberate, but when I opened the tent flap, there was nothing but mist weaving through the trees. I whispered a prayer and zipped the flap tight. Morning came pale and thin. I packed up, checked my bearings again, and walked. Always walking. I followed a trickle of water downhill, thinking it might lead to a road or shelter. Instead, it led me deeper into nothing. Hours passed. I rationed water, ate sparingly. My phone remained dead, a useless rectangle of glass. The compass needle quivered like it was nervous too. By the third day, my voice was hoarse from calling. I hadn't seen another human. The trail that had once been so alive with hikers felt like it had swallowed me whole. I found a clearing where sunlight touched the ground and decided to make camp there. From that small circle of light, the woods seemed endless, a wall of green shadow. That night I dreamed of the trail, how it looked when it was easy, when laughter echoed through the shelters. When I woke, I almost expected to hear other hikers unzipping tents nearby, but all I heard was the sigh of wind through pine. Day after day, I moved in widening circles, marking trees with small strips of cloth so I wouldn't walk the same ground twice. Sometimes I thought I heard voices. Once I swore I saw a flash of orange through the trees, like a backpack or jacket, but when I ran toward it, there was only a cluster of dead leaves. My food dwindled to crumbs. I gathered berries carefully, remembering every warning about poisonous plants. I boiled water from the stream, made lists in my journal, dates, thoughts, small hopes. August 1, still here, trying to stay positive. August 3, heard a plane. Tried to wave the emergency blanket. They didn't see me. By the second week, the pages filled with fragments instead of sentences. My handwriting wavered, letters slanting downward like they, too, were losing strength. Each night I built a small fire with damp wood, hoping smoke would rise high enough for someone to notice. But the smoke just sank into the canopy and vanished. I started talking out loud, partly to keep myself company, partly to fight the fear that I might forget how to use my own voice. "You'll be found," I told myself. "You just need to stay put." But staying put was its own kind of madness. The woods played tricks, same trees, same rocks. Even when I tried not to move far, I sometimes returned to camp from the wrong direction. Once, while collecting water, I stumbled upon a deer skull half buried in the moss. The empty socket stared back at me like a warning. I left it there, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night I wrote, "If they don't find me soon, I hope they find this." Rain came hard the next morning, drumming on the tent like fists. Water seeped through the seams, soaking my sleeping bag. I curled up, teeth chattering. The cold felt personal, like the forest itself wanted to test how much I could take. When the storm passed, everything was silent again, so silent that I could hear my heartbeat. I sat outside the tent, staring at the mist rising off the ground. A squirrel darted past, the first living thing I'd seen in days, and I almost laughed from relief. That afternoon, I heard a helicopter. The thrum echoed faintly through the valley. I ran out waving my silver blanket, screaming until my throat burned. The sound faded, and was gone. I sank to my knees and cried. Not the soft kind, but the ugly, shaking kind that empties you out. That night I wrote, "I think I am near Route 27. If someone finds this, tell my family I tried." Morning came thin and silver, light dripping through the canopy like water through a sieve. I'd stopped marking days, but I could feel time piling up behind me. Heavy, invisible. My face was thinner, hands shaking whenever I tried to write. I told myself I'd climbed a higher ground. From a ridge, I could see a road, a power line, something. The climb started easy. Soon it turned cruel. The soil slipped underfoot, stones rolled away. My breath rasped loud enough to startle birds. Halfway up, I paused to drink. The water smelled of mud and roots, but it was life. I sat and stared at the world below, a green ocean with no shore. That's when I saw it. A clearing, brighter than the rest. Maybe a meadow or a swamp. Maybe salvation. I pushed toward it. Branches tore at my sleeves. I fell once, twice, lost my footing on slick leaves. When I reached the open ground, I found only fog curling over stumps. Still, I laughed. Real, hysterical laughter. It echoed back at me until I sounded like a stranger. I set the tent again, patched the holes with tape. My body ached, but sleep was worse. Dreams of voices calling my name only to fade before I could answer. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a sound. Not animal, not wind. A rhythm 1, 2, pause, like footsteps circling the camp. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then, whisper quiet, a pine cone rolled across the ground beside my tent. I unzipped the flap. Nothing but darkness, trees shifting like giants. I wanted to scream at them, show me the way out, but the words stuck in my throat. I crawled back inside and waited for morning. When dawn came, I packed faster than ever. I didn't want to know what had been out there. Fear can keep you alive if you let it. By midday, the terrain opened into rock and wind. My legs trembled. I hadn't eaten in almost 2 days. I found mushrooms under a fallen log. White, perfect. I remembered every survival warning. Never eat what you can't name. I left them untouched. Later, I found a patch of blueberries. Sweet, real, miraculous. I cried while eating them. That night, I made a fire from dry twigs, small as a candle flame. The heat felt like forgiveness. I held my hands to it and whispered to the woods, "I'm still here." The next morning brought fog so dense it erased everything beyond 10 feet. My own breath came back at me in white ghosts. I followed the sound of running water, hoping it led downhill. It did, into a gorge choked with boulders. Crossing it meant climbing over slick stone, one careful step at a time. Halfway across, my boot slipped. My knee slammed hard. Pain shot up my leg, but nothing broke. I lay there shaking, staring at the blank sky. It hit me then. No one knew where I was. Not the rangers, not my husband, not a soul on earth. The trail I'd loved had turned into a maze built just for me. I thought of home. The smell of coffee, the way morning light hit the kitchen tiles. It felt like a dream I'd made up to keep myself sane. When I reached the far side of the gorge, I collapsed under a spruce. My breath came in gasps. I pulled my journal from the pack, pages wrinkled from rain. If anyone finds this, I want you to know I tried. The forest is beautiful, even when it means to kill you. The pencil broke mid-sentence. I didn't bother sharpening it. That evening, the clouds parted for the first time in weeks. A slice of sunset bled between the trees, gold, orange, fierce. I watched it until the color drained away. For the first time, I wasn't afraid. I built a fire tall enough to reach the stars and whispered names of people I loved into the smoke as if it could carry them home. The next day, I stayed where I was. My legs refused to move. I rationed the last of the food, half a protein bar, 1 sip of water. The forest was utterly still. Then, a sound. Distant, mechanical, unmistakable. A helicopter. I jumped up, waving my emergency blanket, screaming until my chest burned. For a heartbeat, the noise grew louder. I could almost see it above the ridge. Then the sound turned away, fading into silence. I sank down and laughed. Not from humor, but disbelief. I'd been so close. Night returned. I lay staring at the thin fabric ceiling of my tent, tracing patterns in the moonlight. I realized that every trail, no matter how long, ends somewhere. Maybe mine just ended here. I closed my eyes and listened. The forest breathed around me, creaks, sighs, the faint rustle of unseen animals. It didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt like it had simply accepted me. I whispered to it, "Okay, you win." But the forest didn't answer. It just kept breathing. When dawn came again, I felt light, not hungry, not cold, just light, as if the woods had finally let me belong. I packed what I could, tied a strip of bright cloth to the nearest tree, and sat down to rest. Somewhere far away, a bird began to sing. It was the first song I had heard in days, maybe weeks. I smiled, eyes closed, letting the sound fill the silence. That's how I choose to remember the end of my trail, not as a tragedy, but as a final hike into peace. I used to think the woods went quiet at night. They don't. When you're alone out there, miles from any road, you start hearing the truth. The whisper of wind through pines sounds almost human. The drip of water from a leaf can make you sit upright, heart hammering. Every sound has weight. Every shadow breathes. I was 30 days into my through hike when I reached the Smokies. Tennessee side. A long, punishing stretch of uphills that left your calves burning and your mind half hallucinating from exhaustion. I had planned to camp at Cosby Knob Shelter that night. Word was, it was quiet. No crowds. That was the problem. By the time I arrived, the sun was sinking, burnt orange bleeding into the ridgelines. The shelter sat like a stone coffin at the edge of the forest, half hidden by rhododendron. The logbook inside was nearly empty. One entry from the day before read, "Something big walking near camp last night. Heavy breathing. Didn't see it. Stay alert." I told myself it was just nerves. Everyone hears things in the woods. I cooked instant noodles, watched the sky fade from gold to gray. I was alone, except for the dark. Somewhere off in the trees, something moved. A heavy thump. Another. Then silence. I froze. The smell of pine and smoke filled my lungs. I listened. A branch cracked. Not far. Probably a deer, I whispered, though my voice shook. I swept my headlamp across the tree line. Nothing. Just 1,000 vertical trunks, black and endless. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it up to my chin, and forced myself to close my eyes. That's when I heard it again. Breathing. Slow, wet, dotty, deep enough to rattle the air. It came from right outside the shelter wall. I lay still, every muscle tight. The wood creaked under a massive weight. Then, sniffing. Long inhales, like it was tasting the air. A bear, I thought. Has to be. Just stay still. My food was in a bag, hung from the cable outside. I'd done everything right. The breathing grew louder. Then, scratch. The sound of claws on wood. Another scratch closer to my head. Something nudged the wall. The entire shelter shuddered. I sat up fast, flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam hit the far corner. Nothing there. But when I turned toward the opening, my stomach dropped. 2 eyes stared back. Amber in the light. Huge, huge. Unblinking. It stood at the edge of the fire pit, a silhouette darker than the night behind it. I saw the rise and fall of its chest, the steam of its breath. The bear took a step closer. I screamed. The sound tore out of me before I could stop it. The bear reared back, startled, then dropped to all fours and charged. I dove behind my pack, heart slamming so hard I thought it would crack a rib. The bear stopped short at the shelter's entrance, too big to fit inside completely. Its head swung side to side, jaw snapping, claws raking at the floorboards. It roared, so loud it felt like the air tore open. I grabbed the bear spray. My hands were slick with sweat, trembling. I aimed and fired. The hiss filled the air. The bear recoiled, coughing, growling deep in its throat. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. I sat there shaking, gasping, trying to process what just happened. I wanted to believe it was over, but the woods didn't go back to normal. The night stayed dead silent. No crickets, no wind. Just a heavy, waiting quiet. I should have run. Should have packed up and left. But the thought of walking the trail in total darkness, alone, felt like suicide. So I stayed. I moved to the center of the shelter, back against the wall, bear spray gripped tight. Every creak made me flinch. The hours crawled by like wounded things. Sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off, because the next sound I heard didn't make sense. It was laughing. Low. Human. Dadialatory. From somewhere out in the dark. First hours after it vanished were the longest of my life. Every snap, every rustle, made my heart leap. I couldn't tell if it was the bear returning, or if my own imagination had begun playing tricks on me. My eyes darted across the shelter walls, straining to pierce the suffocating black. The wind carried scents I couldn't name. Earth, wet pine, and something metallic. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just the adrenaline, just the remnants of panic. But deep down, I knew the night wasn't over. Time lost meaning. Minutes became hours. Hours became a slow crawl of eternity. I told myself stories to keep sane. Maybe it left. Maybe it's gone. Maybe dawn is only an hour away. But each thought twisted into its opposite. Dawn felt like a cruel joke, still so far off it might never come. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate footstep outside the shelter. Not running, not clumsy. Purposeful. Every thud pressed against my chest like a fist. I froze, my breathing shallow. Counting every second, the sound moved. Closer. Around the corner. Back again. I couldn't see it, but I felt its presence. Heavy. Predatory. Alive. Waiting. I gripped the bear spray tighter, my knuckles white, and whispered into the darkness, "Go away. Just leave me alone." The shelter shifted as if something pressed against its walls. A shadow stretched across the wooden floor. A trick of my flashlight. Or maybe something more. I realized that my imagination had begun feeding the fear, turning every tree branch, every bent log, into something monstrous. I tried to remind myself it's a bear. It's just a bear. But bears don't move like this. Not this deliberate. Not this intelligent. The night dragged on, every moment folding into the next with no difference. My stomach knotted. I could feel sweat cold on my skin. I couldn't sleep, couldn't move. I whispered to myself, over and over, repeating the same mantra, "You are safe. You are safe. You are safe." Hours later, a scraping noise from the far side of the shelter made me flinch violently. Something shifted. A shadow moved along the tree line. I could hear breathing again, slow, measured, closer this time. I realized I was no longer just afraid of the bear. I was afraid of the night itself. The dark had weight. It was alive, watching, waiting. Every sound, every crack of a branch sent my mind spinning. Was the bear circling me? Or was it something else? Some creature born of the wilderness itself? Patient, cunning, intent on testing the limits of fear? My thoughts fractured. I imagined whispers carried on the wind, shapes that slithered in the corner of my vision. I was trapped in a world where the line between reality and imagination blurred with each heartbeat. The shelter creaked. Something pressed lightly against the outer wall. I shouted, but my voice was small, swallowed by the trees. The pressure vanished. Silence. And then a rustle, always moving, always around me, never letting me rest. I sat huddled against the wall, shaking, staring into the black. I thought of home. I thought of warmth, safety, lights. The trail felt like a labyrinth built just to break me, to strip me down to nothing. Hours passed. Dawn began to bleed through the trees, weak and gray. I blinked against the light. The sounds had faded. The forest seemed calm, almost normal. My hands ached from gripping the bear spray. My knees were stiff. My heart still hammered like a drum in my chest. I stepped out cautiously, flashlight flicking over the empty clearing. No footprints. No movement. Only the familiar sounds of the forest waking, birds calling, wind through the trees, the distant babble of a stream. I realized I had survived the night. But something inside me had changed. The woods were no longer just a trail to hike. They were a living, breathing entity, patient, silent, and aware. And I knew, deep down, that even though the bear was gone, the fear would linger. Even now, I remember that night clearly. The smell of pine smoke, the cold press of fog against my skin, the constant feeling of being watched. I still feel it sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment or walking down a quiet street. The shadows move differently now. Every sound is heavier. And I think of that night on the Appalachian Trail, and I shiver because I know that horror doesn't always wear a face. It wears patience. It waits. And it remembers. You don't expect to die on the trail. At least I didn't. Not that night. Not when the sky was clear and the stars were almost polite about it. Death is supposed to happen somewhere else, on a highway, in a hospital, behind glass, not in a circle of campfire smoke and borrowed quiet. I remember the day up to the last ordinary minute, like a calendar burned into my head. We'd split up around noon, just like hikers do. You meet people. You trade bread and stories, you say. See you at the shelter, and mean it. He had a trail name, everyone does, a one-syllable handle that fit his posture sovereign. People said he was odd. People said a lot of things about strangers on the trail. I remember thinking none of it mattered. I remember thinking there was nothing to worry about. I walked those last miles with the sun at my back. The trees leaned over the path like a cathedral, and I hummed a stupid tune to myself to keep the bugs away from my ears. I passed places where the trail rose and fell like a sleeping animal. A doe watched me go and then melted into the trees. The air smelled like damp leaves and cheap sunscreen. I arrived at camp with the kind of tired that unlatched your smile, satisfied, light, the kind you get after a long day's honest work with 2 feet. There were 3 of us at the clearing when I got there, me. Ronald, Ron, and a woman whose laugh made you want to sit by her fire. We stacked our packs, swapped water, and watched shadows lengthen. Sovereign came in late. He had a way of moving like he didn't care if people watched him. He sat off by himself on a log, more shadow than man, and rolled a cigarette slow as he stared at the glow of our fire. We invited him over eventually. That's how it is. You pull a log up, you split your food, you ask about Miles. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said he was heading north and didn't need much. A little company. That's all. I said something kind. We talked. It was normal. Then it wasn't. When you're on a trail for days, you learn to read people by small things, how they tend their gear. Whether they laugh like they mean it. Whether their hands shake when they drink water. Sovereign's hands were steady as stone. His voice was steady too, like radio static. He told stories in a way that removed you from them, like a narrator rather than a participant. We joked. He laughed a bit, but the laugh had a cliff edge to it. The night spun small and accurate, smoke, a frying pan, the soft click of a headlamp as the forest did its ordinary things. We drank tea. We crossed the path, talked about the ridge we'd tackle tomorrow. Nobody left early. People fell into the shelter and slept with the normal bundle of fear and hope that hikers carry. I lay back, the tarp above like a second sky. The milky smear of stars looked safe. It was after midnight when the first noise came. At first it was a small thing, someone murmuring, a foot scuffing a rock. The shelter cradled sound and muffled it until you couldn't tell whether it was inside your head or outside. I heard Ron breathe more loudly than he had all night. The woman beside me shifted. There was an animal sound, maybe a raccoon or something, and a laugh that was too high, a little too close. I put my hand on my phone to check the time, then stopped. There was no signal anyway. What you learn out there is that the path is a rung ladder of conveniences, water, shade, shelter. And at night, those conveniences feel fragile. You lean on them like they are promises. Did you hear that? The woman whispered. I did. Or thought I did. That happens at night. The mind fills the silence with other voices. The noise came again, the scrape of a boot, the rustle of fabric, a voice low and urgent. It sounded like someone arguing with the dark itself. Then Sovereign's voice cut through. Not what he said, but how. Quiet. Clipped. Keep it down, he told someone. There was an edge in it. Control. The kind that muffles you. The sleeping bag muffled most sound, but my ears were open like a map unfolded. The others were quiet. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself that was that. But there was a rawness to the air now, like a bell just struck. The scrape got closer. People move in and out of shelters all night. To pee, to smoke, to cough. I expected a silhouette in the doorway, a flashlight beam. What I did not expect was the flash of a blade catching moonlight as it passed the edge of the shelter. I saw it the way you see a photograph wrong first, a sliver of metal, a finger length, then nothing. My chest dropped into my soles. The woman beside me gasped. Ron's head snapped up. A figure moved at the lip of the shelter like a shadow stepped into frame. Clothes dark as old coffee. A face half hidden by a hood. He didn't look at us. He sliced the air in a way that left wetness in my throat. Some instinct that I never thought I owned screamed, run. He didn't run. He paused. He looked at us. The smile he wore was not a smile. It was an aperture. He said, easy. Where are you going after this? Like he was asking for directions. Like this was a normal converse. Ron tried to joke. He moved forward with a lightness that was supposed to dispel the tightness. Maybe he thought it could be laughed away. Maybe he didn't want trouble. Maybe he was trying to show he wasn't afraid. The knife flashed again. It moved too fast for me to think. Ron stood there, a human to a madman, and tried to step between us. The man pulled the blade in a single, small, clinical motion. It was a quickness that had something rehearsed about it, the kind of movement someone practices until it's smooth as breath. I had the awful, nauseating clarity that we were not in someone's idea of a violent moment. We were the targets of intent. There was a cut. Ron's eyes widened the way mine did the first time I nearly fell from a ridge big, incredulous circles. He had the shock-slowed movements of a person who has been struck at the core of what keeps them being a person. There was a sound Ron made, not loud, not long. And then he was falling. Time unstitched for me after that. The world telescoped to the sound of fabric, and the phone skittering off the floor, and the metal of a headlamp clattering. I lunged, a reflex, a stupid, terrible impulse. I don't know why I moved toward him rather than away. Maybe I thought I could fix it. Maybe I thought I could bargain with life. He hit me then, not with the knife, but with him. He was a force like a winter wind, a human body that took up space and broke through resolve. He shoved me to the ground and his hands were on my shoulders, pressing so hard I thought the air would be squeezed from me. He smelled like smoke and old beer and something chemical that made the back of my tongue buzz. "Don't make noise," he said, flat, only a few inches from my face. His breath smelled of copper and cold. His voice had that same flat rhythm that I remembered from sitting around the fire. But now it ripped into me. I can't explain the precise logic the mind uses when it decides how to survive. There's a small black book of rules you memorize without meaning to. When they are crazy, don't argue. When they're violent, don't flinch. When they're unpredictable, become a shadow. I lay still. I made myself stop breathing too loud. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I could feel wetness on my sleeve, and for one stupid breath I thought it was due. He moved away from me then, circling, like he was appraising property. His knife flashed. The beam of a headlamp hit it and made the metal scream. He bent over Ron for a moment, and I heard a gurgle. The woman had curled into herself in the far corner, hands over her mouth. She was not screaming. Not yet. The kind of sound takes a while to recover. I fumbled for the SOS tracker in my pocket, Small, bright, a rectangular salvation. My hand hit the cold plastic and slipped. Everything slowed and then sped up. The man before me looked up, and I saw the wrongness in his face like stitch marks in a portrait too wide a grin. Eyes that focused as if sliding into a lens. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I knew. Like you know a string is going to snap if you pull it too far. That one small motion could be the line between life and something else. My thumb found the beacon by accident and pressed. It was almost comical how banal it felt. One small button on a market device meant for getting you out of blizzards and floods. I had never thought I'd use it like this, an instrument of last arguments. The light blinked. Somewhere, hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away, someone would read the words I had no voice to say. He saw me press it. The blink caught his eye like a moth. He swore then, low, animal, and lunged. People run in two speeds: the mechanical, practiced run for normal exertion, and the animal run you discover when something is after you. Mine was the latter. I felt the floor take me, and the shelter become a tunnel. The man hit the tarp with a grunt. His boots scuffed dirt. The knife scraped wood in a sound like a wrong-shaped bell. I rolled, I pushed, I crawled, I stumbled. The woman was ahead of me, a shape already moving, a sound of flight. We burst out into cold like breaking a glass. The air knocked at my face with a wet slap. Outside, the world was a high-contrast movie, silhouettes of trees, a wash of moon, and the lonely trail snaking down into nothing. The man followed, knife held like a conductor's baton, rhythmical and deadly. I ran. Maybe it was reckless. Maybe it was stupid. I just ran. It lasted as long as nightmares do. Too long to be over, too short to be anything else. Every branch felt like it might claim my foot. Every root wanted to turn me into a story stuck halfway across the path. I heard him behind me, heavy footfalls, a dark figure moving with a precision that made my skin peel with cold. And then, as if the world had decided to tilt in my favor, I stumbled into a clearing where a group of hikers had left packs and shoes and the low glow of a dying lantern. They were awake now, startled and disoriented, faces pale silver and awful with light. The man hesitated at the edge, and for a moment, a single eternal heartbeat, I thought he might run. He didn't. He surged forward like the tide, and the clearing became a stage. I can't remember the words exactly. Someone shouting, a name, an order. Someone else was on her feet and tackled him by surprise, boots tangling, a grappling, a grunting. People who've never had to physically restrain someone don't know how much pure animal effort it takes. It became a pile of limbs and curse words and the sound of cloth tearing. The knife clattered away into leaves and twigs. Somebody called the police. Someone else called for a tarp, shouted for bandages. One man, maybe a veteran, maybe just a person with air that smelled like certainty, pinned the attacker with the hard calm of someone who's practiced control. The attacker's eyes flared and then slid away. He curled inward like a thing deflating. We were alive. The immediate terror ricocheted and then left us, thin and shaking. Blood, when you first notice it in that context, is a strange color. Not red as the movies, but a red diluted with the dirt of a trail and the white of a sleeping bag. We tried to make jokes, half laughs, to tether us back to human things. Ron was quiet, eyes emptied by shock, his breathing shallow. Someone found the SOS signal on a SAT app or a phone. Someone took my hand and squeezed it like they thought that would keep me from falling apart. We kept talking, not because the words helped, but because they filled the space where anything worse could happen. We wrapped wounds, slung packs, made small heroic decisions that felt enormous in the moment: who would go to the road, who would stay, who would call. The police came later, white and blue like a quiet apocalypse. We answered questions we barely remembered. There were long pauses where we all just looked at each other and tried to piece yesterday into usable facts. The man, sovereign, tried to explain himself. but explanations are fragile when gravity is bent. In the weeks after, people asked me how I'd found the courage, why I hadn't screamed earlier, why I hadn't fought more, why I'd sat still when the blade first flashed. I didn't have language for it then, and I don't always now. The honest truth is this courage in the moment is whatever you do. Sometimes it is screaming, sometimes it is stillness, sometimes it is the stupid mechanical press of a thumb on a tiny plastic rectangle that says help. I learned a lot of ordinary lessons. Always carry your emergency beacon, where you can find it without thinking. Hike in groups if you can. Trust your gut. Those things matter. But what I learned deeper, ugly and bright and personal, is that the trail is a place of fragile agreements. You agree with the world that you will walk, and the world will remain indifferent, and sometimes kind. When someone else negotiates a different contract, one that values other people as obstacles or curiosities, then the agreement is broken, and you discover how small your plans are in a universe that can be moved by a single person's hands. Months later, I still wake with phantom sounds of blade flicking silver, the scrape of boots. I still catch myself checking corners, scanning the doorway. I still wonder if I did everything I could. Sometimes I replay the night like an old map, looking for a different route. But I also remember hands that pulled me to safety, voices that anchored me back to ordinary daylight, the way a stranger's shoulder felt when they held me upright. It reminds me we are not only vulnerable, we are also astonishingly tethered to whatever compassion others decide to lend. We went back to the trail that year. Not the same route, not at the same pace. You can't let fear rewrite the rest of your life's itinerary. But when the path narrows and the trees grow thick, I find my thumb still reaching for a pocket I carry like faith's small plastic, bright edge, a habit learned in fire. It is both relic and armor. The knife didn't take everything. It took a night. It took a piece of a man named Ron and left the rest of him to mend like rope. It left me with a sharper edge, a different sense of what ordinary safety means. Maybe that's the trade the trail asks of those who keep walking. You will learn how the world can be cruel, but you will also learn, with brutal clarity, how often strangers will stand between you and everything worse. That night changed me. It taught me to move with my eyes open, to trust the alert click of my own instincts, and to never underestimate the small miracles, a blinking dot on a plastic box, a stranger's hands, the unplanned chorus of other humans who happen to be awake when it matters most. It taught me that survival is not heroics in the cinematic sense. It is the stubbornness of breath and the slow, awkward stitches of people trying to hold one another together afterward. If there's a moral, if listeners want closure, remember this: the trail doesn't owe you safety. It offers beauty and challenge and the rawness of being alive in a place without walls. Carry gear, know your exits, walk with people when you can, and keep the little beacon in your palm like a prayer, because sometimes it's the only prayer that matters. There's a hush that falls over the mountains when the light thins, an expectant silence, like the forest is holding its breath to hear what you're going to say. I had learned to read that hush the hard way. It told me when a storm would come, when game was moving through the ridge, when a night would be trouble. That night, it told me only one thing: watch. I'd come into that stretch of trail thinking I knew the rules. Daylight, stay on the white blazes. Night, find shelter and keep your fire small. The town map said Catawba was a slow, gentle place, a stop for hikers to rest and trade canned peaches and gossip. The trees there felt older than some towns. Roots knotted like old hands. I'd set up camp early, not because I feared the dark, but because the sky had been promising rain and because I liked to be ready. It was late August. The heat had given way to a clean, autumnal bite that crept under collars and into sleeping bags. I had a small ring stove and a tin mug of coffee, the smell of which always made the world seem more organized. The shelter I found that night was a small lean-to tucked into a dip off the main path, a place where the smoke from my little fire pooled and warmed my boots. I spread my pad and unrolled my thin bag and felt the kind of contented exhaustion only miles and blisters can buy. There was a logbook nailed to the shelter beam, a handwritten roll of names, dates, and jokes. I read half of them before the light dimmed, each entry a tiny handhold to other lives. People sign their names like they leave fingerprints, proof they were here, proof they moved through this place. I wrote my own name into the page, feeling for a second like I was adding my voice to a long whisper. The first odd thing was a smell. It drifted across the clearing like smoke without a fire, faint and sweet and wrong. I paused with the back of my hand on a pot of noodles, sniffed the air, and told myself it was from someone else's camp, maybe a far-off fire. Hikers burn wood and old wrappers. Smells travel. It didn't register then as the kind of smell that should make anyone still at the fringe of the trees take a long, thoughtful breath. I ate. I cleaned up. I let the fire lie down to embers. I zipped up my bag earlier than I normally would. There was that hush again, pressing. My headlamp's beam trembled when I used it to arrange my pack, as if the light itself were unsure what belonged illuminated and what should be left in shadow. Sleep only pretends to come gracefully. For me, it arrives like a deal. One eye open, one ear listening. I woke once and thought I heard a branch move. A small, bare sound, the kind of thing a raccoon might make. I glanced toward the shelter entrance and saw nothing. I told myself to relax, that the night had 1,000 small lives, and none so interested in me that they'd bother my camp. Then I felt the space near the fire change, as if someone had stepped into the ring of my light and not turned it on. The figure was at the edge, standing still like a statue carved of dark cloth and hair. When I saw him properly, my breath hitched, not because I was afraid of a living man, but because his skin looked wrong. It was patchy and blackened, as if he'd been held too long to a coal, charred along the cheeks and neck in a way that made me step backward without thinking. His eyes were plain, pale glass that ate the light like riverstone swallows the sun. At first I thought he was injured, a hiker who'd been through a bad fire, some terrible accident. People sometimes showed up in worse states than that, but there was nothing in his posture that spoke of pain. He moved slowly, deliberately, like the world had taught him patience. He reached down with hands that were ash dark and plucked up a small split log, the sort you toss into a stove. He added it to my embers, as if he were continuing a job someone had started. There are very particular sounds you make when you are stupid with fear. The involuntary sharp intake, the reactionary whisper you hope someone nearby will catch and interpret as a joke. I made both. "Hey," I said, trying to shape my teeth around a tone that sounded casual, or at least practiced. "You lost?" He didn't answer. He didn't look at me. He only kept looking toward the dark beyond the tree line. He moved with a slow, deliberate choreography, energetic enough to be human, too ordered to be wild. When he finally turned his head, the light from the embers caught the burnt edge of a face and made it glow like something under glass. His mouth opened, and I swear he made a sound. Not a word, not a breath, but a small exhalation like a leak. It was a sound that could be pity or hunger. I couldn't tell which. The logical part of my brain listed possibilities: a ragged veteran, a hiker who'd been in an accident, a transient, a person with a skin condition, someone playing some kind of cruel joke for the shelter log. The rest of my body, the late night, tired, marrow-deep part, did not accept those explanations. The man's clothes were weirdly intact for someone whose skin looked as if it had been scorched. There was no singed hair, no smell of burning on him, other than that same sweet ghost smoke that had drifted over earlier, like incense for a house that no longer stood. He bent down then, not toward the fire but toward the sodden earth beside it, and arranged the scattered half-logs into a neat stack. His movements were small, respectful. It wasn't the kind of theft that would make me shout, nor was it the kind of gift that made sense. He was doing work he had taught himself to do, and it was as though we were both actors following separate scripts in the same play. My throat went dry. I reached for the beam where I'd hung my water bottle and felt the old familiar urge to pull some bar of human kindness into the scene. Offer, ask, help, hate. Instead, I said nothing. Words felt like stepping through smoke. He straightened and looked at me again, and when he did, there was the sense of a history between us that did not involve words. I felt accused in a way I had never been accused before. Not of crime, but of remembering wrong things, a smell, a sound, the way a corroded hinge remembers a house it once belonged to. "Are you okay?" I managed, voice small. He cocked his head as if the question itself were a kind of echo. For a terrifying instant, I thought he would answer. He opened his mouth, but all that left it was a thin trail of smoke, like someone exhaling the remains of a match. And then he smiled. His smile did not match the rest of him. It was not a smile born of lips doing a job. It was a shape of light that seemed to belong to another face entirely. The smile made my hands go cold. "Where are you from?" I asked, though even as the words left me, I hated the banality of them. The forest is not polite to everyday questions. He lifted a hand, scarred and almost transparent in a way that suggested skin had once been over fire and then had been varnished by some other process, and pointed not toward town, but toward the dark that hummed beyond the trees. It was a direction that said there, but also here. He gestured once, then somehow set his palm against my shoulder. It was not heavy. It left no warmth. For a moment, I felt like a hanger with weight removed, empty, suspended. Then he turned and walked away. He vanished into the trees as if the night had swallowed him mouth first, leaving only that odd smoke scent and the low memory of a figure that had been more shadow than person. I sat for a long time after he left. The coals turned to black glass and the crackle faded. My notebook lay open beside me, unfinished sketches, the usual list of miles and aches, and the page seemed suddenly strange, as if the letters meant something else now. I tried to imagine running after him, calling his name, shouting. Part of me wanted to do that like a reflex. Another part of me understood that running would be an invitation. Some things that move through this world prefer not to be chased. When I finally fell asleep, it was a jagged sleep, the kind where the body gives up while the mind remains on patrol. I woke with sun slanting through spruce and the sense that the night had taught me something important about how narrow the edge of ordinary life can be. That morning, I hiked down the trail with my pack lighter by a log and my ears heavy with the memory of the meeting. At a small convenience store in town, hells of cheap chips, the whir of a fridge motor, I bumped into a woman who asked me if I had seen anything odd. She had eyes like the color of rain and wore a cheap bracelet, and when I told her about the figure, she didn't blink. Her thumb moved over the corner of a paper with the kind of practiced motion that people who read old maps have. "You saw him?" she asked quietly. I told the truth, that I had. She didn't smile. "There was a house burned out on that road, about 4 miles from here," she said. "About 4 days ago. Whole thing, no survivors. We found the letters on the porch, half burned." The coffee I'd bought tasted sour in my mouth. "How?" My voice faded. She shrugged, like she was listing the weather. "Sometimes people say they see things," she said. "Sometimes they don't." I left with the paper folded in my pack. The edges made maps in my fingers. The address was a smear of ash on the inked line, like someone had tried to remember a place and failed. The thought of the burned house stacked behind my mind like kindling. That night, I was back at the shelter before the sun had fallen all the way. I made a larger fire, not because I wanted to scare anything away. Fire does not scare things that have been burned enough to leave their skin, but because the small flame made shadows fall differently, and that felt, for once, like an ally. I lay awake listening to the forest again, and I wondered whether the man at my fire had been a person at all. People tell stories like this and they call them 100 names hallucination, grief, the wildness of a tired brain. I know those words. I am capable of using them. But the smell that hung in the air, sour sweet like wood and old paper, stayed with me. It was the smell you get when a memory is burned, and someone has tried to put it back together. When the moon rose, I thought I heard the faint scrape of a footstep. I whispered into the dark, not meaning the sound to leave my mouth. If you're a person, don't hurt me. If you're a ghost, don't make me forget myself. The wind carried nothing back. Then, from the hush beyond the trees, came the sound of a door closing, soft, decisive, like someone had finally finished setting things in order. I sat up. A presence moved at the edge of my light, not approaching, just standing, watching. I felt watched the way you feel watched in a church's dark, reverent, small, wrong. The ember scent curled around the stranger's silhouette like a ribbon. He stepped forward, and the light caught him, and he smiled with the kind of smile that was both invitation and warning. He reached inside his torn jacket and pulled out something small, wrapped in ash-stained cloth. He set it by my foot. It was a photograph. The photograph was heavier than it looked. When I lifted the ash-stiffened paper, the image inside was almost apologetic. Faces caught in a summer smile, necks tilted toward one another like the world was a small, shared secret. A porch behind them, white paint flaked, a single choke of ivy climbing the post. Kids in the front, grins too big for the frame. A man at the edge of the photo held a woman's hand, something ordinary and solid that made my fingers tremble, as if I'd been given someone else's memory to hold. When I saw him, the man at my foot, my breath made a small cloud. His hand hovered over the photograph like he might change his mind and take it back. For a ridiculous second, I considered throwing it into the fire, watching the glossy surface curl and go black. Instead, I sat frozen, the photograph between us like a treaty. He did not speak. He never had spoken, but his eyes, pale and strange, traced the faces with something that could have been sorrow, or something like it. He lifted his head, looked at me, and for a second, there was a softness I hadn't expected. Then he turned, pocketed nothing, and moved away into the trees as silently as a wind. I didn't chase him. What was I going to say, anyway? "Excuse me, sir, you dropped your haunting memento?" It felt foolish even as the thought formed, and foolishness in that place tastes like ash. Instead, I sat until the sun was low and the shadows long, and the photograph warmed under my hand like a small, stubborn thing that belonged to someone. I traced the shape of the man in the photo until my fingertip left a smear and realized I was alone with other people's memories, and that was more unsettling than almost anything else the trail had offered me so far. When I walked into Catawba the next day, the town was the same kind of small and stubborn as the picture. A general store, a post office, a diner where the coffee was thick as a secret. The woman at the counter eyed me when I came in, maybe because my clothes still smelled of ember, or because I had wandered in early with a photograph folded in my pack like contraband. She nodded at me like we had a shared script that didn't require speech. "You found something out there," she said. I told her about the man and the photograph. I left out the parts where my skin had gone tight as a drum, or where I'd seen the man lay a log on my fire as if continuing an omitted chore. The woman did not flinch. She poured my coffee and slid a napkin across the counter like a small concession. "Check the paper," she said. "Bottom of page 2, fire up on Old Hollow Road." I hunted for the paper like someone looking for a sign. The headline was short and businesslike: "House fire on Old Hollow claims family home." The summary ran a few lines about a late-night blaze, about a cause still under investigation, about a family who'd been out of town and returned to find embers where a life had been. There was no sensationalism in the language, only a quiet ledger of loss. I read it twice, then again, fingers tight around the newspaper like it might tear. The story mentioned an address, and the address matched the blurred smudge on the paper I had held the night before. Later, out on the trail with the photograph burning a hole through the fabric of my pack, I drove the skinny road up to the burned house. It was 4 miles off the AT, tucked behind a stand of pines. And when I found it, the place looked exactly like the photograph had promised, and not like it at all. The porch was a bone of charred timbers. The windows were empty eyes. The yard was a grave of fallen toys and a still-standing mailbox with the house number that matched the clipping. There was a small shrine on the stump of a tree, flowers wrapped in plastic that had been bleached by sun, a child's shoe nailed to the wood, a note weathered pale. People had come, left things. The photograph in my hand did not feel private anymore. It felt like contraband stewardship. I set the photo down on the top rail of the burned porch and stepped back a little, like a visitor who needed permission. The photograph lay there, not yet warmed by sun, not yet acknowledged by anything living. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, as if a long film had been rewound, a soft draft moved through the ruined house, and something below the floorboards shifted it. A sparrow hopped across the ash like an appointment. A neighbor at the end of the lane, old knees and kindly shoulders, appeared with a bottle of water and a sun hat and looked toward me as if I'd been expected. "You the one who put that up?" he asked. No, I said. "I found it near the trail. Thought they might want it back." His jaw worked. His eyes became a map of years. "People come here and leave things. Sometimes the house remembers back." He shrugged like that was an ordinary thing. He didn't say more. In small towns, some griefs are named and some are not. I walked the perimeter of the house like someone scanning an altar. The ash blackness crunched under my boots. I felt intrusive, like I was reading a private letter aloud. The woman from the diner, she appeared out of nowhere then, coffee in hand, hair tied with a red bandana. She set a wreath of artificial flowers on the stump and crossed herself quickly as if performing a rite. "You shouldn't be here alone," she told me, flat and fierce. "Not until afternoon anyway. Things get loud at night." Her eyes flicked to the ruined shutter, to a place where the wood had bubbled and cracked like an old wound. "Loud how?" I asked, though I feared the answer. She stared for a moment. "Some people hear a radio that's not there. Some say someone is walking through the ash, setting stones in order. People talk in their sleep if they stay here too long. You'd think grieving would be quiet, but it's noisy in its own way." I left the photograph on the rail, my fingers reluctant to let go. When I climbed back into my car, the town seemed to hold its breath and let me pass like a secret that had just been told loud for a moment and then returned to its place. The forest swallowed the road behind me, and I realized that I had expected the man to appear, to step from the trees and reclaim his photograph like some small, sorrowful thief. No one appeared. The house remained quiet, a memorial and an accusation and not yet a resolution. I took the photo with me again when I returned to the trail because I couldn't leave it there, because I had no authority to deposit someone else's past in a place that's supposed to be private and yet felt public. The man's pale eyes in my memory felt less accusatory now and more like a key I had no map for. After that, the encounters were small and strange. Once, a hiker at a shelter said his fire had been restacked in the morning and he'd blamed raccoons until he found the neat line of half-burned logs tucked like books at the base of the ring. Another woman swore she'd had a photograph placed in her sleeping bag, not taken but gently set, a family smiling up like permissions. People laughed it off with tea and jokes. Their voices were too loud, too bright. There's a practical shell people build around the weird to keep themselves from cracking under it. At night, the man would show up now and then on the trail, always at a distance, always at the edge of visibility. I'd see him as a shape moving between trunks, or catch a glimpse of a pale face at the rim of a clearing. The more I expected him, the less he resembled the thing of my first terror. He felt less like a predator, and more like a memory with legs, mendicant, half-formed, and stubbornly present still. The photograph didn't stop being strange. I carried it like a charm and a burden. I would pull it out sometimes and study the faces until they blurred with tears and dust. When I did, the man's eyes in my memory would grow clearer, and I would think of the burned house and the way small towns bargain with grief, the way people speak of what is gone in plain tones, because that is how you keep it from swallowing you whole. Eventually, I did something I hadn't planned. I took the photograph and walked back up the trail at dusk, carrying it like an offering. I set it on a stump some 30 yards from where I'd first found it, on neutral ground, not on the porch, not in the shelter, just a place where the trail curved and the wind came through with a voice like a bell. I left it there, wrapped in a silvery piece of emergency blanket I'd bought on a whim months before. When I stood up and turned, the man was there at the edge of my light, like he had been waiting to see what I would choose. He didn't move closer. He nodded once, the small human gesture of recognition that said everything and nothing. Then he turned and walked away, and for the first time since the photograph had been in my hand, I felt something like closure press against my ribs. People will want me to tell them I saw him melt into smoke, or that he faded like a damaged photograph. I didn't. He walked into the woods and the trees took him, the way trees do with everything that asks to be hidden. But in the silence that followed, there was a softness I hadn't expected, a sense that something had been returned to where it belonged, or that an old story had been handed back to the proper hands. I kept walking. The trail is a greedy thing that devours small rituals and turns them into memories. The photograph, wrapped in my emergency blanket, felt lighter somehow. Maybe I had done nothing at all, just shuffled an artifact from one pocket of the world to another. Maybe that's all grief asks for, sometimes a small attention, an acknowledgement, a warmed place for a memory to rest. The last time I saw a pale face at the rim of a clearing, it was a long while after the photograph incident. I stopped, as I always did, and watched. The figure paused, and then continued. Whatever it was going on with its patient task, I didn't shout. I didn't run. I simply folded the emergency blanket tighter around the photo and walked on. There are things the mountains will never explain. There are people and places that keep doing their small rituals whether or not anyone watches. You learn, after a while, that part of being out there is making room for mysteries. They live in the same air as birdsong and rain, and they have perhaps as much claim to the land as anyone. At night, when the wind comes down the ridges and carries with it the faint, sweet smell of something burned, and the memory of a face smiling too politely from a photograph you once held, I sometimes stop and listen. The forest hums on, neutral and enormous. I light a small fire, tend it with careful hands, and for a moment I feel like a keeper of things I do not understand. Responsible, perhaps, for a small kindness that might mean nothing at all in the ledger of the world, and might mean everything to someone or something that waits in the trees. And in that small, strange way, the mountains teach you to carry both doubt and reverence together, like two stones in one pocket. Heavy, necessary, and balanced. They tell you to respect the mountain like you would an old dog. Don't surprise it. Don't yank on it. And for God's sake, don't make assumptions about how it's going to behave. I respected the mountain with all the kind of reverence you give a thing that might kill you without malice, but reverence doesn't make you immune to stupid luck. It was late February. The ridgelines were clean, and a little cruel hard, blue air, fingers of ice woven through the roots and rock. My group was small. 4 of us who'd been training together, pushing miles at dawn, swapping food bars and bad jokes. We weren't through hikers on a years-long pilgrimage. We were weekend saints, testing endurance between jobs, trying to convince ourselves we were tougher than we felt. We picked a technical stretch that morning, a line that hugged the face, and then dropped into a run of slabs and alder that would spit you out near the James River. The map said, "Exercise caution." The trail said nothing. The mountain said nothing at all. It just existed, huge and indifferent. I'd done this sort of route before. I'd scrambled, I'd balanced on rock edges with my hands in the cold and my breath fogging like small ghosts. That day, the sun warmed the world enough to make the ice lie in a thin, treacherous sheet over stone. You could see it and still betray you. I remember thinking, foolishly, that if anything could go wrong, we'd at least be close enough to each other for someone to help. The first half of the hike was honest and steady. We joked about who packed what, who forgot the extra stove fuel. My boots clicked like small drums on the rocks. There was a camaraderie that doesn't exist in cities. No need to be anything but yourself, because the mountain will correct you with a slip or a bruise if you're not. We reached a narrow section where the trail veered close to a steep drop. It wasn't one long, straight cliff you might find in a horror movie. It was a tangled slope, a mix of rock, root, and ice. Below it, the world fell away in a dark web of trees and stones and river glimmer. I stopped at the edge and took a drink from my bottle. One of the others, a smaller guy who liked to race me up slopes, signaled he'd go first. We traded grins. "You got this," he said, voice muffled by the hood and wind. I moved with that stupidly confident step people get when they think skill and habit are guarantees. The first foot planted true. The second slid. There's a moment when your body realizes it's no longer commanding the action. The brain sends the signal to stop, and your body has already started falling. It's as if a movie strip skipped a frame. You're conscious of two incompatible things at once, the world moving and you not being part of it. I hit for a second like a twig thrown against a wall, tried to grab something, a root, a flaring bush, anything with purchase, and my hand met ice that was colder than language and just as harder than language. The world pivoted. There was the visceral sound of stone meeting bone, the sick music of shoulder and hip slamming into off-angle reality. I tumbled. The fall was violent and almost beautiful in how precise it was. One roll, another hit, a crunch of earth, and the soft sliding whisper of a body on frozen leaves. Adrenaline takes strange liberties. It narrows the world to a flashlight beam of presentness. Pain doesn't exist as sensation so much as a fact. You catalog it like inventory. Shoulder messed up, left leg bleeding, pack shifted. The sounds fold together into a single white noise: my breath, the thud of my heart, the distant calls of my friends. For a second, I had a floating, cinematic clarity. This is happening. This is bad. Don't move too much. I remember thinking of the simplest things: my mom's voice, the smell of coffee, the stupid playlist I'd been listening to that morning. Clarity doesn't always bring wisdom. Mine brought inventory and cold. I slid further, maybe 100 feet. I don't know, before something arrested my fall. It wasn't a graceful save. It was a tree limb that snagged my backpack and a broken sapling that took a portion of the impact. I felt my body wedged between two fallen trunks, like a broken mannequin left by a careless shop. The angle was terrible. The wind carved lines into my face. I knew, in a way that was both complete and stupid, that I might have fractured more than my pride. I tried to move to check my limbs, and a white flash of agony lanced through me. The toes on my right foot didn't want to answer the call. My left leg felt like it was arguing with itself. I couldn't tell where the pain ended and the cold began. I shouted. Not a long yell, not theatrical, but enough to make noise. My voice was small in that big bowl of forest. Someone answered almost immediately. My friend's face descended into view above me, eyes wide. And then our training took over: quick assessment, control, steady hands. They asked where it hurt. I said the knee and the side. I tried to keep the breath from turning into a sob. Pride carries useless weight on a day like that. It looks bad, the friend said, using that bathos people use to sound practical. We tried the basic first aid: make sure I could move toes, stabilize what needed stabilizing, keep warm. The problem with a fall on a frigid ridge is that adrenaline will hide some damage, and the cold will make everything worse. We wrapped me tighter in my jacket, tried to keep circulation going. Nobody wanted to move me more than necessary. Every movement could make things worse. That is the ministering paradox of being hurt. Action is both remedy and risk. We attempted to radio for help. The mountain laughed at our signal. Cell reception was a rumor there. We sent texts that read as single dots of hope and then died. I felt small with a big thing to solve: the arithmetic of distance, time, and cold. Even if someone hurt us, the mechanics of a rescue on a February ridge are vicious. You need resources, time, and luck. An hour bled into 2. My bones felt like they belonged to someone else, detached and mobile. I tried to keep warm by breathing into my cues and staring at my friends' faces until I could memorize them. That's what you do in fear. You anchor in faces. You count the breaths, the shoes, the watch faces. You tie yourself to people like a ship to dock. Then we heard something. At first it could have been anything. A distant hammer of rotors. A sound that lifts the world, a helicopter. The sound came like forgiveness. We waved, using every shiny thing we could find: emergency foil blankets, a silver water bottle turned to mirror. The rotors approached, a machine the size of a small intention, and I felt something like both relief and dread. A helicopter changes the equation from hopelessness to possibility, but it also amplifies your vulnerability. When you see the sling, the ropes, the faces hovering over you, you become the object of someone else's bravery. That can be humbling. They called down to us, voices thin with altitude, and we explained our dire little map of injuries. They assessed and decided I needed a hoist. That choice is a lottery and a technical problem. The slope was bad. The wind flirted with competence, but their faces were calm, and in that calm, I found a foothold. The rescue was an orchestrated violence. I was asked to move and then told to hold still. They strapped me into a harness that was warm and brutally tight. The rotors chewed the air and sent a rain of dry snow in all directions. The cable descended like a centipede of metal, the crew at the end, a human compass. My friend gripped my hand, and for a beat I thought of saying everything that matters in a lifetime. I couldn't manage it. I simply nodded. They lifted me. The world fell away in the wrong direction. Height warps your stomach into an animal that wants ground. I saw the ridge like a map, and then the trees like teeth, and the river like a shining ribbon. The sling swung and the wind tried to pry me loose. I gripped the harness hard enough to make my knuckles light. My breath came ragged and metallic in my throat. Up there, suspended, the fall looked elegant and monstrous all at once. I could see my friends as small figures waving like flags. I saw the mountaintop like a page torn from a book, and the town down in the valley like a set of toys. I thought of the thin line between choosing to move and being forced to move. I had not died. That was the first miracle. The second I would learn was that the self-care of some strangers and the willingness of trained people to risk themselves would turn what could have been an obituary into a story. They brought me to a clearing and set me down like a thing returned. Machines smelled like oil and warmth. The medics spoke in jargon and kindness, the sort that smoothed the worst edges. They loaded me into a helicopter with a blanket that was too hot and an oxygen mask that smelled like medicine. The rotors lifted again, and for the first time since the ground had become a moving thing, I felt something like safe terror. The flight to the trauma center was a blur of pain medication and clipped conversation. I closed my eyes and let the drugs in the machine cradle me toward the place with fluorescent lights and the promise of stitches and answers. I could not help thinking in those sterile moments about the ridiculous smallness of life's plans. You walk one ridge and the rest of your life recalibrates. When the medics finally whispered the prognosis, I heard words that would have changed someone else's life story and now changed mine, like a page being turned broken bones, torn ligaments, swelling that would have to be handled with care. They told me the word miracle in a tone that was cautious and reverent. They said the trees had stopped me in a way that no single chance could adequately explain. But a miracle in the mountain's ledger isn't an answer so much as a debt. You survive, and then you repay by learning how fragile you really are, and by measuring the small mercies every morning. You live with the knowledge that you were caught by something, a rope, a limb, a stranger's willingness to call for help. And it becomes a thread in your life you carry where people can see it. They wheeled me into bright lights and a smell of antiseptic, and the world condensed into questions and stitches, and the very human functional work of fixing a body. Nurses moved with the economy of those who have seen too much, yet still know each action matters. My friends sat like saints in a waiting room. their faces drawn and rawed. That night, in a hospital bed with a shoulder immobilizer and a leg in a brace, the adrenaline finally pooled into a slow leak. I had to breathe through the realization I'd been cheated into surviving by a sequence of decisions and strokes of luck. I felt awkward gratitude. There was shame in the recklessness, and another cleaner humility in the knowledge that I was still intact enough to tell the story. They wheeled me into bright lights and the smell of antiseptic, and the world boiled down to small mechanical tasks, strips of tape, a nurse's quiet questions, someone tightening a brace until it clicked. My name sounded strange in the mouth of an ER tech who'd never met me before. It belonged to a life that had been paused and now was being fastened back together. The doctor's voice was calm, the kind that tries to make math out of pain. Multiple fractures, contusions. We're going to stabilize, get you ready for surgery if needed. Those words arranged themselves like a foreign language I had been forced to learn mid-breath. I nodded because nodding is sometimes the only useful thing you can do while the world is diagnosing you. An hour later, in a room that smelled like metal and coffee, my friends sat with their boots still on, jackets zipped up like armor. They folded into the chairs as if their bodies were trying to hold still so mine could be repaired. Their hands shook when they reached for mine. That sight, small and human, was one of the first things that truly broke me. Not the pain, not the wires and tubes, but the look on a friend's face when he realizes the person he counted on to take one more step is suddenly fragile. The surgery, the morphine, the dim drifting between wakefulness and sleep. Those things blurred. What stayed with me were the small conversations in the recovery room, jokes about ridiculous trail snacks, a promise to put new studs on my boots, a casual vow that sounded like prayer. People came and went. The doctor said the word long-term like it was a neutral word. Long-term meant stitches. It meant physical therapy. It meant learning to trust my leg again. The first weeks were clumsy and raw. I learned how to make coffee with one arm, how to get in and out of a car without reinventing ballet. I learned to shower a plastic chair and to accept that my pace had shifted. Friends brought food. One showed up with muddy hiking poles he'd cleaned. Another read trail forums to me like serialized sermons. They all said variations of the same thing. You're still here. It sounded obvious and miraculous at once. Recovery is less heroic than it is stubborn. It's a calendar of small victories, bending a knee, a degree more than yesterday, sleeping through the night, standing without that automatic, gripping fear of falling. Physical therapy became my new trail. The therapist, blunt, patient, possessed of a strange tenderness, taught me how to make the scar tissue behave like a new muscle. We worked through tasks that felt ridiculous to my formerly proud body, balancing on a foam pad, stepping onto a stair with precision, practicing pressure on a leg that had been trusted implicitly until the moment it wasn't. You learn to celebrate odd things. The first time I hiked a short loop without pain shooting into my hip felt like reaching the top of a mountain I'd never dreamed I'd climb again. The first time I didn't flinch when someone clapped behind me. Small things that rebuilt a person in increments. But the body isn't the only thing you mend. The fall stitched something into the way the world sits against me. When you've been grabbed by raw chance, when a limb, a tree, something accidental and indifferent kept you from being destroyed. You wake with a certain wakefulness. The ordinary things that used to exist on autopilot no longer do. I still check the edge of a trail. I still tie my bootlaces twice and talk to the ground like an apology. I sleep with the window cracked so the world can breathe in the same air as me. I'm more likely to pack an extra layer, carry a spare headlamp, build a proper plan. Sometimes the trauma shows up in ways that make no pragmatic sense. A sudden flash of white on a roadside mirror sends that same cold drop through my mouth. The staccato cadence of a distant rotor makes my heart punch a rhythm in my throat. Night is a weather system now. I give it respect I didn't know how to pay before. Those reactions are awkward companions. They don't always go away. You learn to fold them into your life rather than fight them every morning. There's also the very particular indebtedness you carry toward people who help. The rescuers became a constellation I checked on the pilot, whose hands were steady despite wind that whined, the medics who didn't flinch at gore, the two strangers in the clearing who lunged without calculus and began the wrestling that stopped a night from becoming worse. I wrote thank you notes that read like small, fierce prayers. I made cookies for the rescue crew and sat with them while they told me stories that sounded like other people's tragedies, but were just raw experience. Gratitude, you realize, is not always a quiet thing. It can be loud and messy and insistently practical, showing up for someone who showed up for you. Months passed. I returned to the trail in pieces and then in larger patches. The first time I hiked again for more than an afternoon, the soles of my boots felt new and a little strange, like someone else had walked in them. My pace had softened into something less competitive and more tender. I found myself noticing the way light shook through the leaves, how a ridge smells different depending on whether the last storm was snow or rain. I started to hike with people more often, friends, people who checked in and carried extra water without thinking of it as charity. There's safety in numbers, yes, but there's also a balm. What surprised me, the thing that consistently upends tidy narratives about survival, was how little the fall decided the rest of my story. I thought for a while that the fall would be a dividing line before or after. In truth, it became a thread woven through a life that was, delightfully and exasperatingly, still complicated in all the same ways. I had paychecks, grocery lists, the small humiliations of adulthood. I had laughter and arguments in evenings when the couch swallowed me whole. The mountain did not get to turn my life into a parable. It simply left its mark. People asked if I was afraid to be back on the rocks. Yes. Fear is not an enemy to exercise. It's a signal to interpret. Some days the fear is an honest, useful thing. It keeps me from sloppy moves, from hubris. Other days it overreaches and makes a molehill look like a cliff. The trick I learned is to listen to it, not obey it slavishly. Respect without being ruled by it. I kept notes, not the triumphant kind, but practical journals. What gear worked, which crampons bit, which ascent made me feel small in a good way. I got better at checking weather models and reading the subtle language of thaw lines and wind. I relearned the mountain in a way that felt like reacquainting with an old friend who might, if you push the wrong button, remind you of their temper. Every so often, I visit the clearing where the helicopter had lowered me. It's a small, quiet place where the wind tells you what it wants and the trees are the oldest witnesses. I leave a folded emergency blanket and sometimes a small snack packet. Ridiculous, maybe, but symbolic. It's my way of giving back to the place that both punished and saved me. People leave things there now. 2 tokens of thanks, a boot, a little carved bird. It makes me think of the fragile contracts we enter with nature and with one another. Contracts where sometimes we keep our end, sometimes we don't, and sometimes luck leans mercifully toward us. I also found a new kind of patience with other people's mistakes. When someone slips on a trail and swears and laughs and keeps going, I remember the cold hole in my chest during the fall, and I'm gentler. When a friend refuses to set out on a questionable route, I don't scold. I respect decisions that protect life. The trail doesn't require bravado to validate a person. Sometimes at night, when the city is quiet and I'm not unpacking a pack or patching gear, I sift through memories with a clinical curiosity. The fall doesn't have an obvious mythic meaning. It was a sequence of errors and accidents and help. But the small miracles, the tree that caught my pack, the rope that rose to pull me up, the hand that found mine, those became a quiet theology I keep in my pocket. Not a religion exactly, but a way of seeing favors and courage as real, active forces. They don't cancel the danger. They complicate it with human decency. If there's a short advice I'd offer to anyone who listens, it's this: respect the mountain, yes. Prepare for small absurdities. Carry a beacon and know how to use it. Don't assume that experience makes you immune. Assume the opposite and plan accordingly. Walk with people if you can. And when you come back from something that almost takes you, don't rush to perform gratitude. Live it. Show up. Be the person who holds the harness when someone else's life is momentarily a rope in the air. Life after the fall is not neat. It doesn't get simpler, but it does get sharper in certain ways. Your senses tune to small mercies, your friendships enlarge with new threads of loyalty, and your purposes reorder into things you actually choose instead of things you inherit by habit. Some mornings I still wake with the echo of rotors in my ears. When I close my eyes, I can see the ridge from above, in a cut of landscape so precise it could be a map printed in my bones. Most days, though, the sound of my own step on the trail feels like the right kind of music. Steady, reliable, and mine. I walk with a humility that is not shame but truth. I was lucky, I was helped, and I will keep walking because that is how I keep repaying the hands that lifted me.